20,000 years ago, the world was not as we know it. It was a planet gripped by an unrelenting chill. The Ice Age had not just arrived. It had settled in, stretching its frozen fingers across continents and centuries. Gigantic glaciers blanketed much of the northern hemisphere, burying forests, valleys, and ancient rivers beneath mountains of solid ice. Even the sky seemed paler then, muted, sunless, grey. Seasons did not follow the gentle rhythm we now take for granted. Winters were long and merciless. Summers were brief, unpredictable, and often brought little relief. The very air was heavy, laced with the fine dust of crushed stone and ice, blown across empty plains by howling winds. No crops, no cities, no metal, only survival. And yet, life was there. Small bands of humans, nomadic, alert, and hardened by generations of struggle, moved across these lands with little more than fire, memory, and will. They were hunter-gatherers. They roamed vast stretches of icy wilderness, chasing herds of mammoths, reindeer, and wild horses. They wore layered furs sewn with bone needles, carried stone blades chipped from flint, and spoke in voices that echoed through frozen canyons. Their homes were not permanent. Caves offered shelter when available. When not, tents made of animal hide and mammoth tusks were erected against the bitter cold. They ate what they could hunt, what they could find, and what they could store. Scarcity was constant, famine frequent, death ever close. Still, they endured. But survival was not enough. Humans are not creatures who only persist. They observe, they imagine, they adapt. In the flickering light of a fire in a wind-beaten cave, someone began to wonder, what if the animals don't come next season? What if the ice never retreats? What if the world is always this cold? These questions didn't come with easy answers, but they planted the first seeds, not in the ground, but in the mind. Life on the edge. Imagine their world. A typical day begins before dawn. A family huddles together for warmth in a narrow rock crevice. The fire has burned low, and someone must brave the chill to gather wood, if wood can even be found. Ice creaks outside like a living creature. Snow falls silently, endlessly. Visibility is poor. The next hunt could take days or return nothing. Children are taught to track footprints, to listen for distant hoofbeats, to identify edible roots, bark, and berries, many of which are poisonous if prepared incorrectly. Women and men both share roles, for everyone must contribute to survive. Elders are respected, not simply for their age, but for their stories. Stories that map the land, warn of dangers, and preserve the tribe's fragile knowledge. There is no written language, no calendar. Yet their awareness of nature is profound. They know when the sun will rise low and long, when the winds shift, when the herds return. This is not superstition, it is survival. And sometimes, things begin to change. A group stumbles upon a cluster of wild grains near a glacial riverbank. They taste it, cautiously. They notice that when some seeds fall, they sprout again. Others, stored in baskets made from reeds, last through the winter. A woman begins to collect and scatter them, not as an experiment, but perhaps as a prayer for the next season. Unknowingly, they are taking the first steps towards something revolutionary. The birth of observation. This era, often overlooked in modern history, is when humans first began to push back against nature's randomness. Not through domination, but through understanding. They observed the land closely. They saw which valleys thawed first after the coldest months. They noticed which animals returned in regular cycles. They learned that some seeds grew better in ash-covered soil left by old campfires. That food buried underground in cold pits spoiled more slowly. That herds avoided certain exposed ridges, but gathered in hidden, wind-sheltered hollows. They may not have had words like climate or ecosystem, but they lived those concepts every day. And slowly, over generations, this knowledge began to accumulate, not just as instinct, but as culture. Farming, as we now know it, had not yet emerged, but its spirit had. These Ice Age survivors were climate pioneers, scientists without a language for science, engineers without blueprints, thinkers without writing. Their tools were the sky, the soil, the seasons, and their own relentless curiosity. They didn't invent farming in a flash, but they invented the conditions that would allow it to grow. They invented patience. They invented trial and error. They invented the idea that maybe, just maybe, the future could be planned. A fragile flame in the cold. It is important to remember, this was not a golden age. It was an age of hardship, pain, and constant loss. But from that cold darkness came sparks of insight, of ingenuity, of a quiet kind of rebellion against nature's cruelty. In a world that wanted them to perish, these early humans began to build their own terms for survival. They couldn't stop the cold, but they could learn how to live around it, through it, and, eventually, in spite of it. Before there was agriculture, before there were civilizations, before there was even the idea of controlling the environment, there were farmers of thought. And it was in their silent choices, their small discoveries, and their stubborn refusal to give up that the foundation for humanity's future was laid. The wind did not ask permission. It howled across the land, sweeping snow into the faces of travelers who had no choice but to move forward. Ice cracked underfoot. The sky remained heavy with clouds. The sun little more than a memory in a world dominated by cold. But the humans walking across that frozen wilderness carried something new, not in their hands but in their minds. They had begun to change, not dramatically, not all at once. Change in the Ice Age came quietly. It came in the way someone bent a branch to mark a trail, in the way someone returned to the same riverbank to gather seeds that had once saved them from starvation. It came in the way families began to settle, just a little longer than before, staying through a season rather than always moving. The world outside remained brutal, but inside these small human groups, something was stirring, a sense of agency, of possibility. In the beginning, it was just fire. Fire was more than warmth. It was protection. It was cooking. It was memory. Fire became the center of their small worlds, where they gathered, where they told stories, where they passed on knowledge. But more importantly, fire marked space. It turned a piece of the wild into something human. When you could control fire, even a cave lost in a snow-covered cliff became a home. That control was fragile. Wind could extinguish it, rain could ruin it, but slowly, over generations, people became better at keeping the flame alive. They learned to store embers in dry moss. They learned to protect it in stone hearths. They passed down tricks to ignite kindling from nothing but flint and will. With fire, they had claimed the first tool of stability. They had turned one piece of chaos into something dependable. From there, other pieces followed. It began with storage. Animal bladders, woven baskets, hollowed out bones. These became more than just containers. They became time machines. With them, food could last beyond the moment it was found. A lucky hunt no longer meant a feast followed by famine. It meant safety for tomorrow. And in a world ruled by unpredictability, this was a radical shift. The idea that one could plan, the idea that something could be set aside, not just for another person, but for another time. People began digging pits in the frozen earth, lining them with grass and stones, sealing them with hide. They used the cold to their advantage. They built caches away from camp, safe from scavengers, and remembered exactly where they hid them. Some of these early settlers preserved meat and roots for weeks, and if a family survived a harsh season, it was often because of the forethought of a single person who chose to save rather than consume. But even as they stored, they observed. They noticed, as all close observers of nature do, that some things came back. The grass near their camps grew thicker where food had been spilled. Some roots returned every year to the same spot. When seeds were dropped accidentally, small plants sometimes followed. It wasn't farming, not yet, but it was a pattern, a suggestion. And once seen, it could not be unseen. That knowledge began to shape behavior, not through lectures or lessons, but through repetition. A woman would scatter seeds along the edge of a river out of habit. A man might drag a log to mark the place. A child watching silently would do the same next year, not even knowing why. These weren't agricultural revolutions. They were human ones, slow, quiet, and persistent. Animals, too, were no longer just prey. Some were noticed to be less fearful: a wounded deer that stayed near camp, a group of goats that returned to the same valley. Patterns, relationships, the first experiments in coexistence. Some animals, over time, stopped fleeing. They grew used to human presence. And humans, in return, began to see animals as more than meat. They were warmth, tools, milk, and movement. Already, the idea of domestication was taking root, not through force, but through familiarity. Even the materials they used reflected this new sense of control. Tools became more refined. Stone blades were shaped with greater precision. Antlers were carved into needles. Animal bones became fishhooks, harpoons, awls. Their hands became architects of survival. Every item had meaning. Every design told a story of trial and error, of frustration, and finally, of triumph. In the darkness of a hut pressed into the hillside, someone stitched two pieces of hide together so well it kept out the wind. In a campfire circle under the open stars, someone taught a child to sharpen a flake of obsidian into something sharp enough to cut through sinew. These were not just skills, they were signs of a species taking its first steps toward shaping the world rather than being shaped by it. It was around this time that art began to appear. Handprints on cave walls, animal forms etched in stone, charcoal sketches of hunts, spirits, sun, and snow. To some, these were prayers. To others, maps. But more than anything, they were expressions of thought beyond the moment. The first sparks of symbolic thinking, the ability to represent, to imagine, to create. It was a small leap from painting a bison on a cave wall to recognizing when and where bison migrated, from drawing the sun to learning when it would rise higher in the sky and melt the snow. The mind that drew was also the mind that calculated, and the people of the Ice Age, though primitive in tools, were advanced in perception. They had begun to measure their world, not in numbers, but in rhythms, not in clocks, but in cycles, and from those rhythms came patterns, and from patterns the courage to plan. That is the essence of control, not total domination, but the beginning of understanding, the belief that the world might be read like a story, not feared like a monster, that nature, though vast and unforgiving, might have a rhythm to it, and if one listened closely enough, lived attentively enough, survived patiently enough, perhaps it could be followed. So even as the world remained brutal and cold, something remarkable had happened. The humans of the Ice Age were no longer simply reacting to nature. They were responding with purpose, with fire, with storage, with memory, and with vision. They were beginning to influence the shape of their own survival. It was not yet farming. It was not yet civilization. But it was the first spark, a spark that would one day become a fire so vast it would reshape the world itself. There was no single moment when it happened. No grand revelation under a starry sky. No line in the snow where someone stepped over and said, "Now we are farmers." It happened slowly, almost invisibly, like the thawing of ice at the start of spring, barely noticeable at first, a trickle, a shift, but over time, undeniable. These Ice Age people had long been wanderers, hunters and gatherers. They moved where the food led them. Their knowledge of land was deep, but it was practical. Find the herd, follow the river, watch the sky. But as generations passed, something had changed. What was once temporary had started to feel. Certain camps became places people returned to, not just because they were safe or warm, but because they offered something more valuable: predictability. The river bend where wild barley grew year after year, the clearing where wild pigs returned each spring, the slope that caught the morning sun and thawed before the valley floor. These were not just coincidences anymore. They were opportunities. At first, it was the plants. They had been gathering wild grains, nuts, and roots for centuries. But now, some families began to scatter leftover seeds where they had harvested, not as a strategy, at least not consciously. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps they had seen the sprouts grow the previous year and assumed it might happen again. Either way, they came back. And when they did, The plants had returned, more abundant, more clustered, more reliable. They didn't call it agriculture, they just called it luck. But it wasn't luck. It was the result of countless small decisions, repetitions, and quiet tests. Without realizing it, they were beginning to cultivate. The process was painfully slow. Many seeds failed. Many plants refused to grow. Soil was still a mystery. But they learned. By watching which parts of the field grew better, which plants survived the frost, which ones ripened first, they began to select, naturally, instinctively. The plants that grew best were gathered most. The ones that failed were abandoned. Over time, the seeds that remained were the ones best suited to human care. Domestication wasn't invented, it was invited. And with plants came permanence. The more they invested in these sites, the longer they stayed. A family that once moved every week might stay a whole season. Then another. They began to build sturdier shelters, huts of stone, wood, or tightly bound thatch, half buried in the earth to hold in heat. They started digging irrigation ditches, not out of science, but out of necessity. When rains failed, they used whatever was nearby, hollowed logs, animal bladders, hand-dug channels to bring water where it was needed. In these places, people began to shape the land. They cleared away brush. They burned patches to renew the soil. They watched the sun, learning where its warmth fell longest. They turned the ground from wild to willing, not by force, but by understanding. The animals followed, or perhaps they were led. Domestication began with proximity. Dogs were likely the first, not hunted, but welcomed. Wolves that lingered at the edges of camps may have begun as scavengers, but the ones that didn't run when humans approached, the ones that barked at threats, the ones that stayed close without attacking, were the ones allowed to remain. Over generations, these animals changed. Their fear faded, their loyalty grew, and suddenly, humans had allies. Goats and sheep were next. Reindeer, pigs, and cattle followed in other regions. These animals were no longer just hunted. They were corralled, fed, sometimes protected. They provided not just meat, but milk, wool, dung, and companionship. This was no longer survival. This was the early shape of society. Because with animals came responsibility, with fields came routine, with settlements came community. No longer alone in the wilderness, families had to cooperate. One group tended the animals, another watched the fields. Children gathered wood, elders stored grain. The knowledge that had once lived only in individual minds began to be shared, passed down, improved. Language grew richer, memory stretched further. A bad harvest was not just a tragedy, it was a lesson. And so, the people changed. Their hands still bore calluses. Their lives were still hard. But the rhythm of those lives was no longer dictated entirely by chance. They were shaping their own time. Spring became a season not just of waiting, but of planting. Summer meant tending. Autumn meant harvesting. Winter, still cruel, now meant planning. Life had taken on structure, but there was a cost. With permanence came vulnerability. A failed crop meant hunger. A sick herd meant disaster. And enemies, human or otherwise, could take everything in a night. So they built defenses, dug ditches, raised walls, appointed leaders, created rules, the seeds of civilization, planted in frostbitten soil. They had begun to anchor themselves to the land. It was no longer just the world they walked upon. It was the world they shaped. The earth became their partner, their provider, and sometimes their judge. And though they did not know it, their choices would echo for millennia. In the quiet hills of Ice Age valleys, in the wind-blasted steppes, in the muddy riverbanks warmed by spring melt, something extraordinary had taken root. Humanity had shifted its footing, from a species shaped by its environment to a species starting to shape it in return. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to mark a new era, not just in survival, but in thought. Enough to say, without ceremony, without celebration, that something had changed forever. They were no longer simply foragers. They were at last becoming farmers. The wind still roared, the frost still pierced flesh and bone. But something had changed in the way humans faced it. They no longer saw the world as one unbroken wall of cold. They had discovered something quieter, more powerful than resistance. They had discovered how to bend the cold, to carve out spaces where life could persist, not just by enduring the ice age, but by reshaping tiny corners of it. It began with shelters, not the caves or hide tents of their nomadic ancestors, but dwellings designed to trap warmth and block wind, dugouts set into the sides of hills, where snow itself became insulation, thick sod walls layered with dried mud, entrances placed deliberately away from prevailing winds, fire pits dug into the center, their heat trapped beneath low ceilings. They weren't simply hiding from the cold anymore, they were engineering against it. Every decision mattered. Which side of a slope to build on, where the morning sun first touched the earth, how to angle stones to reflect heat inward. Some even started placing fire-heated rocks under their beds of moss and fir, learning how long warmth could last if stored in the right materials. Over time, entire winter villages appeared that were more than just places to survive. They were systems of warmth, designed by memory and refined by necessity. These were the first microclimates, small zones where the temperature, humidity, and wind were not ruled entirely by nature. They were shaped by human hands and minds. Outside, the climate still raged, but inside those shelters, a different world formed. It wasn't just homes that changed, the ground changed too. People began noticing which places thawed earlier in the season. They dug drainage trenches to steer meltwater away from sprouting plants. They built windbreaks of woven reeds, brush, and even stacked bones to protect young shoots from the sharp breath of the wind. They began to alter the soil itself, adding ash from their fires, fish remains, and composted scraps, turning harsh dirt into something fertile. By controlling just a few square meters of land, they were creating islands of abundance inside a sea of scarcity. And around these islands, culture grew. Clothing became more than cover. It became insulation. Furs were layered with woven grasses or down feathers. Animal fat was rubbed into hides to make them windproof. Some communities began sewing inner linings, building garments with air pockets to trap warmth. Footwear grew more sophisticated. Fur-lined boots, grass-stuffed moccasins, soles hardened by bark or hide to withstand the frozen ground. A man walking into the wind now walked inside his own moving microclimate. Even tools adapted. They carved snow knives that cut blocks for walls. They shaped bone into needles for tighter, more tailored stitching. Sleds and packs were designed to distribute weight over snow instead of sinking into it. Nothing was left untouched by this new vision of survival, not just against nature, but with it, around it, through it. Then came the greenhouses, though no one called them that. They began as simple experiments, pits dug near stone walls, covered with hide or bark, where the warmth of the earth and the protection from wind allowed tender shoots to sprout earlier than in the wild. Transparent animal skins were stretched across frames to catch sunlight. Clay pots were placed to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. These weren't buildings, they were ideas, the idea that nature could be coaxed rather than merely endured. Some early farmers began planting next to hearths, using the constant smoke and warmth to nudge plants forward. Others chose south-facing cliffs, where rocks soaked up the sun's warmth and held it into dusk. They weren't just learning to farm, they were learning to engineer warmth, to redirect life against the odds. And around all this, rituals formed. People began marking time by the warmth of their microclimates. When the snow melted on their slope, when the first sprout emerged from their patch of ash-fed soil. These events mattered more than the distant passage of stars or the turning of seasons across the continent. They measured time not in months, but in conditions they could create. The first calendars were not carved on stone. They were felt in the soil, when to insulate, when to uncover, when to water, when to dig. The humans of the Ice Age no longer lived entirely under the dominion of the climate. They lived in the delicate negotiation between wild forces and designed environments. Each shelter, each hearth, Each stone wall or woven screen was a statement. We do not control the world, but we control this space. And that changed everything. It allowed for planning. It allowed for growth. It allowed for the storage not just of food, but of hope. Because when you can make one patch of land bloom in winter, when you can keep warmth where none should exist, you begin to believe in the impossible. In these microclimates, humans didn't just survive, they thrived. And slowly, these pockets of controlled climate became the foundation of something new: villages, agriculture, civilization. It didn't happen in one generation, or 5, or 20, but it began here, in the warmth of a fire that refused to go out, in a stone wall that blocked the wind, in a patch of green defying the frost. They had not conquered the Ice Age, but in the quiet margins between survival and control, they had invented a new kind of life. The Ice Age was merciless, but it was not mindless. It did not simply punish, it taught. Each bitter gust, each killing frost, each winter that overstayed its welcome, it all became a lesson written not in ink or on stone, but into the muscles, minds, and memories of those who lived through it. The early humans who survived were not just the strongest, they were the most attentive. They watched, they listened, and slowly, painfully, they learned. Climate became their oldest and most consistent instructor. When rivers froze, they learned where the land sloped, just enough to let water flow beneath the ice. When blizzards came, they discovered which animal tracks disappeared first, and which ones lingered. When the sun arced low across the horizon for weeks on end, they realized which slopes drank in more warmth. Every pattern, every shift in light or shadow, every scent carried by the wind, it all held meaning, and meaning became memory. Those memories, passed on in stories, in rituals, in habits, began to shape not just what humans did, but who they were becoming. They were no longer reacting blindly to nature's violence. They were decoding it, reading it, forecasting it. The climate was no longer a brute force to endure. It was a language, and slowly they became fluent. A failed crop didn't mean foolishness. It meant new information. A late frost taught caution. An early thaw encouraged boldness. Each mistake was a note in a longer song, a tune played not by instruments, but by seasons, temperatures, and tides. Children were raised on these stories, told how the snow crusted harder when clouds held certain shapes, taught to feel the tension in the air before a sudden storm. They did not have meteorology, but they had intuition. They did not measure with gauges, but with skin, breath, and instinct. The Ice Age climate gave no mercy, but it offered feedback, and it was this feedback loop, brutal, relentless, illuminating, that made humans something new, something adaptive, something intentional, and eventually, something visionary. The farmers of the Ice Age learned that if the climate could shift, then so could they. If weather patterns changed, they moved their crops. If rainfall vanished, they dug deeper, saved more, waited longer. If wind stripped soil, they built barriers, mulched the earth, anchored it with hardy plants. Resilience became strategy. Strategy became knowledge. Knowledge became culture. These weren't just responses to hardship. They were acts of participation. The land wasn't just something they lived on. It became something they lived with. They began to think in cycles, not just seasonal, but generational. When they burned brush to renew the soil, they knew it would benefit children not yet born. When they chose not to hunt a certain herd during its mating season, it wasn't out of mercy, it was out of wisdom. The climate had taught them that every gain had a cost, every abundance a limit. The cold sharpened more than their spears. It sharpened foresight. In that foresight, culture evolved. Songs were no longer just entertainment. They carried encoded warnings. Myths held the memory of droughts and ice storms. Ceremonies began to align not just with the moon or the hunt, but with signs of environmental change. Even gods, when imagined, were shaped by climate, spirits of snow, fire, rain, and soil. They worshipped the forces that shaped their world not out of superstition, but out of reverence for patterns they depended on. And in those patterns, they found meaning. A blizzard became more than danger. It became a reminder to prepare. A year of scarcity became an opportunity to teach thrift, patience, and gratitude. The weather wasn't just an event, it was a curriculum. In a world before writing, climate was the book, and they read it every day with their bodies, their senses, their memories. Slowly, they began to annotate it, changing their behaviors, improving their tools, building settlements in ways that respected the terrain and the forces that shaped it. And in doing so, they became more than survivors. They became learners. The Ice Age did not break them, it formed them. With every storm that flattened their crops, with every frozen breath drawn through frostbitten lips, with every night spent staring into the void of a white horizon, they were not just enduring the climate, they were becoming its students. And with enough time, with enough failure and observation and adaptation, the students became architects. They began to build, not just with materials but with understanding. Their homes reflected airflow and thermal mass. Their fields mirrored the movement of sun and water. Their choices respected seasons as mentors, not just obstacles. They began to ask a question no species had ever asked before. What can we make if we listen deeply enough to what the world is trying to teach us? That question would become the heartbeat of civilization. But it began here, in the cold, in the dark, in the howl of wind that no longer terrified, but instructed. The Ice Age was no longer just a chapter in human struggle. It was the school where humanity first learned what it meant to shape the future by studying the present. Climate was not the enemy, it was the teacher. And from its harshest lessons, the roots of wisdom began to grow. In the vast, icy expanses where survival was a daily battle, something extraordinary began to unfold, not just in individuals, but among groups of people who gathered, settled, and shared a vision of life shaped by cooperation and ingenuity. These were the first farming communities, and within their shared efforts, the seeds of climate engineering were quietly being sown. The transition from scattered families tending small plots to thriving villages marked a fundamental shift in human history. No longer isolated bands of hunters and gatherers, these communities began to harness collective knowledge and labor to build systems that bent the climate to their will, small at first, but growing in scale and ambition. Together, they constructed more than just homes. They designed settlements carefully placed in sheltered valleys or on sun-warmed slopes, where microclimates could be nurtured and protected. They planted trees and shrubs to form windbreaks around their fields, reducing frost damage and soil erosion. These living barriers were the earliest experiments in modifying their environment for greater resilience. Water, the lifeblood of crops, was carefully managed. Simple irrigation channels diverted meltwater from snowfields to thirsty plants, turning dry earth into fertile ground. They dug drainage ditches to prevent flooding, and built terraces on hillsides to slow runoff and capture precious moisture. Each innovation was a deliberate act of environmental engineering, informed by generations of observation and hard-won wisdom. With these modifications came new social roles and knowledge systems. Certain individuals became experts in weather patterns, soil management, and plant cultivation. These early climate engineers passed down their skills through oral tradition and hands-on teaching, creating the first agricultural knowledge networks. The act of farming itself demanded coordination and cooperation. Planting, tending, and harvesting required timing and teamwork. Food storage and sharing became central to community life, helping to buffer against bad seasons and ensuring survival through harsh winters. The bonds forged through shared effort and mutual dependence laid the foundation for more complex societies. Beyond practical survival, these communities began to develop a profound respect and understanding of the climate's rhythms. They observed how subtle changes in the wind or temperature could ripple through their fields and homes. They adapted their agricultural calendars to these signals, embodying a dynamic relationship with the environment rather than domination over it. In this way, the Ice Age farmers were not just cultivating crops, they were cultivating knowledge, community, and innovation. They were the first climate engineers, crafting landscapes that supported life in ways never seen before. Their legacy is written in the fertile soils of the world, in the terraces on ancient hillsides, and in the very concept of humans as stewards of the earth. In the cold shadow of the Ice Age, they lit a fire of ingenuity that would burn for millennia, changing the course of history and our relationship with the climate forever. The frost that once threatened to erase early human existence instead carved a path of resilience, innovation, and deep connection to the earth. The farmers of the Ice Age left more than fields or tools behind. They left a legacy, a blueprint of survival that echoes through the ages, whispering lessons for every generation that followed. Though the glaciers melted and climates warmed, the knowledge forged in that harsh era did not vanish. It passed from hand to hand, from mouth to ear, woven into stories, customs, and ways of life. The understanding of seasons, of soil, of water management and crop cycles, all rooted in those first communities who dared to farm the frozen earth. This legacy shaped the dawn of civilizations. The terraces, irrigation canals, and windbreaks of ancient societies carry the fingerprints of Ice Age innovations. The mindset of observing, adapting, and working with nature rather than against it became the cornerstone of sustainable living long before the word existed. Yet the echoes are not only in the distant past, they resonate today as we face our own climatic challenges, reminders that humanity's survival has always depended on listening, learning, and innovating. The same principles that guided Ice Age farmers, community cooperation, respect for environmental limits, and careful stewardship are vital as we confront modern climate change. Our ancestors were the first climate engineers, crafting solutions with the tools and knowledge at hand. Their story urges us to remember that technology alone isn't enough. It is our relationship with the earth, our willingness to learn from its patterns, that determines our future. As we look to the future, the echoes of those ancient farmers urge us onward. They challenge us to rebuild our connection with nature, to innovate not just for profit or convenience, but for survival and harmony. The climate that once taught humanity to endure now calls us to listen anew. The lessons of the Ice Age are clear. Adaptation is possible, resilience is built through knowledge and cooperation, and survival depends on the courage to change. In the frozen fields of the past lie the seeds of our future. The echoes through time remind us that while the challenges may be great, so too is the human spirit. Ever learning, ever adapting, ever hopeful.